Okay, lined up.
Thank you, Gina.
Good evening, everyone. I am Councilwoman Joanne Ryan. This is the Committee on Finance regular meeting, Thursday, June 10, 2021. It is 5:07. We are joined by, we have our City Solicitor, Jeff Dana here. We have our Assistant Solicitor, Ken Cheverini. We have, I think we're good. Okay, folks, Madam Clerk, could you kindly read the roll?
Chairwoman Ryan?
Present.
Councilman Naducci?
Here.
Councilwoman Castillo?
Present.
Councilwoman Anthony?
Present.
Councilman Taylor?
Here.
We have 5 present. We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. We are also staffed this evening by our wonderful clerks, Tina and Donna. So thank you very much for making sure this all goes off without a wrinkle. I'd like to ask my committee, please, for a motion first to waive the reading of budget articles 1 through 4. May I have that motion?
Motion made, Madam Chair.
Second.
Motion made by Councilman Naducci, seconded by Councilwoman Castillo. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Those items are waived. Okay, Madam Clerk, could you kindly read item 5 into the record?
Resolution endorsing and urging passage by the General Assembly of House Bill 2021 H-6356 and Senate Bill 2021 S-0927, an act authorizing the City of Providence to finance a contribution towards the unfunded pension liability of the Employee Retirement System of the City of Providence by issuance of bonds.
Thank you very much. For ease of operation tonight, I'm going to move these exhibits into the record all at once. So if I can just get a series of motions here. The first one I have is Exhibit 1 from James Lombardi. James J. Lombardi III, Chairman of the Retirement Board and Vice Chairman of the Board of Investment Commissioners for the City of Providence. May I have a motion to call this? Thank you, Councilwoman Castillo. Exhibit 1, motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by?
Second motion.
By Councilman Naducci. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. So we have Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 is a presentation by the City of Providence Pension Obligation Bond presentation prepared June 2021 entitled Why We Must Act Now to Invest in Providence's Future. It is a multi-page PowerPoint presentation. Appears to be 20 pages of content and a thank you, very nice thank you at the end. We're going to call that Exhibit 2. May I have that motion?
Taking a motion.
Motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by Councilman Naducci.
I'll second the motion, then I have a question after.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it. Item Exhibit 2 is into the record. Let's just get through these exhibits, Councilman, please. The next one is this is a Wainwright presentation for Providence Finance Committee. Submitted by Wainwright Investment Council. It is a number of slides totaling, there are 13 pages to this presentation. May I have a motion to call this Exhibit 3? Motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by?
Second
May
motion.
I have a second? Councilman Naducci. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. We have Exhibit 3 in, and then we have We have two General Assembly pieces of legislation. House Bill 6356 entered May 20th, and we have a Senate Bill 0927 entered May 21st. We're going to refer to both of these together as Exhibit 4. May I have that motion?
Taking a motion.
Motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by Councilman
Second.
Ducci. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Motion passes. We have all our exhibits in. Now, we've got a lot of folks on the agenda today. I'd like to ask the clerk if she could be kind enough to swear everyone who will be presenting this evening in all at once. And then after that, after you're sworn in, if you can identify your name and title for the record, please.
Larry, you're muted.
Madam Chair, if I may, there are two other guests who may need to be testifying this evening. That's Ms. Karen Grandy, who is bond counsel to the city, and Ms. Kathy Riley, who is the city's pension actuary. They are in the guest waiting room. If you're so kind to include them in the attestation and swearing in, I may ask that they be
We'll pull them in.
promoted.
We'll be happy to pull them in. We'll ask the clerk to do that. Councilwoman Anthony, do you have your hand raised?
I do. I just have a question. So these exhibits, because we do have members of the public listening tonight, and they can access the exhibits how?
Madam Clerk?
Councilwoman Anthony, I put most of the exhibits on Confluence.
And would you be so kind as to let people again know how they can get on that?
Isn't it on the head of the meeting?
It's on the agenda where they can click the bit.ly account.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I've gotten two of the exhibits late, so those are not on there, but I can show them on my screen when the time permits.
The plan is to show on the screen whatever wasn't presented, and just to further document what the clerk just stated, the link to the location of those documents are posted with the committee meeting notice at the top with the information, and that is a standard mode of operation. Does that answer your question, Councilwoman?
Yes.
Councilman Narducci? Yes.
Yes, is that the reason why I don't have all these documents? Because they came in late. The only one I have is from Wainwright Investment Council.
I think the exhibits 4 are attached, right, to the meeting?
Exhibit 4 are attached to the resolution itself, and I did not get those until this afternoon as far as entering those as exhibits. And I'm surprised that you don't have the pension obligation bond from...
This is the only thing I received.
Okay, I apologize, sir.
Can we show what,
Yes, I can show
we're going to put it up on
And also-
on the screen.
And
Yes,
also-
Councilman.
Can I just ask a quick question? Maybe somebody can answer it. This resolution on the pension bond, all I got in front of me is number 5, the resolution endorsing urgent passing from the General Assembly. But yet, on the news, Seth Magazine, it was already said that after seeing what he's seeing, he's not in favor of this at all. Am I missing something, or?
Well, we're going to hope to answer your questions tonight, Councilman. This exercise is to have a healthy discussion of the topic. You're going to have an opportunity to ask any questions, and that's why we're meeting here today. So I asked you to give us a little a leeway to get through what should be a value-packed, volume-packed meeting. All right? Thank you, if that answers your question. And I think we just need to get started. So, Madam Clerk, are you all set?
I am all set.
Okay, let's swear everybody in who will be testifying, and then it is going to be a little difficult, but I ask your patience and kindness in identifying yourself and your title in some fashion or order.
Mr. DiBiase, you as well, sir. Please raise your right hand.
You all swear under penalty of perjury that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, help you God?
Yes, I do.
Madam Clerk, on behalf of the Finance Department, Lawrence J. Mancini, Chief Financial Officer, and with due respect, I defer to Mr. Lombardi next, and followed by Mr. Dana, and then all of the outside advisors will take the lead, if I may.
Thank you for serving as Master of Ceremony, Mr. Mancini, Chief Mancini.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Please, folks,
Appreciate that.
introduce yourself.
Jim Lombardi, the treasurer for the city of Providence.
Jeffrey Dana, City Solicitor for the City of Providence.
Mr. Bernazzi,
Eric Bartnazzi, Chairman and CEO, Wainwright Investment Council.
Mr. Fabrizio,
Jeff Fabrizio, Director of Research, Wainwright Investment Council.
Mr. Cray,
Adam Cray, Managing Director of Hilltop Securities.
Ms. Riley,
Kathleen Riley, Senior Vice President and Actuary, Siegel, Actuary to the City of Providence Retirement System.
Ms. Brandy, Ms. Brandy,
Karen Grandy. I'm a partner in the Providence firm of Lock Lord. I serve as bond counsel to the City of Providence.
and then we'll be Mr. Michael DBAs.
That it?
On mute, sir.
Mr. DBAs.
Mr. DeBiase, if you could kindly identify yourself and your title for our record.
Sure, thank you. Michael DBAs, President, CEO, Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, we're
And
gonna,
thank you for indulging me. Thank you.
thank you for helping us get through that, Mr. Mancini, in a very organized fashion. Greatly appreciate the assist. We're gonna start this evening on this a very important topic with a presentation from James J. Lombardi III, who is Chairman of the Retirement Board and Vice Chairman of the Board of Investment Commissioners. So we're going to start with that, and I believe showing courtesy to my committee and those who are listening, we're going to put that presentation up for everyone's review. So I would ask the clerk to kindly make that accommodation.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
if I may just start off by saying I'm here as the treasurer of the city, chairman of the retirement board, former chairman of the medical subcommittee of the retirement board, and vice chairman of the board of investment commissioners. I want to say that I hear a lot of misinformation.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure. I want to just say that I hear a lot of misinformation being bantered around, and I want to say that I can vouch for both committees that we do what is right for the city. Generally, the votes in these committees are unanimous and made up of management, unions, and members of the public. Since my appointment to the retirement board, we always have made the right decisions. I can assure you that in 10 years, nobody has lobbied me to not make the right decision. I will say by no means are we perfect, but we have been confirmed by the Supreme Court on the vast majority of challenges that we have made. Both committees in the board are credible and represented by people who are qualified and care about the city.
Thank you, Mr. Lombardi.
You're welcome. So I did a little presentation to go over, and if anybody can't hear me, please let me know. And it's basically the facts and the options if the pension obligation bond is authorized. And if we go to the first page, I just want to try to go over some facts and history about the pension system.
Hold on one second.
Sure.
Madam Clerk, would you kindly advance the slide? Thank you.
So the employee retirement system's assumed rate of return is established by the Providence Retirement Board of the retirement system. On or about March 24, 2021, we lowered the assumed rate of return to 7% from 8%. We also have asked Siegel in about 6 months from that March date to come back to discuss if 7% is still the recommended number. The Board of Investment Commissioners is responsible for investing funds in the employee retirement system. I know that there's been some questions about the rate of return, but over the last 20 years and during many phases of the 20 years, the average rate of return is 7.3% versus the state's 6.6%. And this is a little surprising, but as you know, the retirement system is overweighted in liquidity because the system is substantially underfunded. So being at 7.3% versus 6.6% is even more is even more surprising, I guess, than what it says. And I'm sure Mr. Bertnazzi will follow up with that. So let me go back to a commission that was started in 2006, where a pension obligation bond back there then was one of the recommendations. Obviously, it was not acted on. Had it been acted on, the Dow Jones was at or about 11,000. Since then, the Dow Jones is up 300%. At that time, the unfunded liability was $600 million. And the going rate on bonds was 6%. Since then, so over the last 15 years, the fund made 6.9%. And had we been better funded, I would argue that number would be higher. In 2004, I issued a report as the internal auditor about the idea of supporting a pension obligation bond. Again, the Dow Jones at that time was 10,000. Today, it's up over 340%. One of the things that I also hear is that we need to change the retirement ordinance. And if you change the retirement ordinance, unfortunately, you cannot materially affect the unfunded liability. So although I do support changing the ordinance in different places, the retirement ordinances, that's not a solution. That may be a solution in the future, as in future employees or a future unfunded liability, but that's not a solution today. I do support the increased contributions to the police department in the current ratified contract, which brings it over the next few years to 13.5%. So, next page, thank you. So, according to Hilltop Securities, our break-even point is between 3.85%, and this is projected, and 4.39%, depending on market conditions. Historically, and again, we don't know what the future is going to bring, 3.85% or 4.39% rate of return is something the city should be able to achieve. But I also want to say we need to add safeguards into the bond documents. Presently, I believe the stock market, and this is my personal opinion, is overinflated with artificial money, and therefore, initially, we must invest conservatively. I do not believe in timing the market. We need a long-term strategy to invest into the market over a number of years. Even after the pension obligation bond, if we were to float it, we would still have an unfunded liability. We must be sure that that unfunded liability will be paid at 100% of the required contribution. We must also limit costs of the pension system. For example, the experience study and the pension valuation is based on an average salary increase rate of 3%. That's something that we must sustain in the future. We must and I would say in documents, bond documents, we must control and limit normal costs. So, for example, the pension benefit costs for current employees should not exceed a certain percentage of the system and clearly cannot exceed the current percentage of benefits. We must continue to think outside of the box. This one potential solution is only one step in the necessary tools to help the city stay solvent. I also want to say the timing and the amount are everything on the success of the pension obligation bond. Although I agree this is new debt to the city, it is not a new obligation. The borrowing of funds is to substitute one debt for another. I believe in order to be successful, we must move fast and responsible on a number that achieves a 60% funding rate. If proper safeguards are put in place, I believe that if we are authorized to issue the bond, we should. Madam Chairman, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you. Okay. How about, let's move to the city side now on Mr. Chief Mancini. I'm going to rely on you to kind of manage our way through the presentations of the administration's financial team. So if you could lead us off, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm pleased to be here this evening, and members of your committee and members of the council. And so, Madam Chair, if I may just start by identifying the roles of each of the parties that are here this evening, if that would be okay with you.
Absolutely.
We introduced from Hilltop Securities. They are the city's fiscal advisor, which acts on advising the city in all major bonding transactions, and have served as advisor on the proposed transaction that is currently before this body, as well as legislation before the General Assembly. And representing this evening is Mr. Adam Cray, who I know that you have seen him present on many occasions to the city of Providence, and has done nearly exclusively all of the city's bonding recently and quite efficiently. Followed by that, we're joined by Mr. Eric Bertinazi and his associate, Mr. Jeff Fabrizio. Mr. Bertinazi and Mr. Fabrizio have been long-term principals of the firm Wainwright Investment Counsel, which has represented the city nearly 22 years, and during many and various periods of time, and as the treasurer and chief of staff to the council has pointed out, has delivered, in many cases, outstanding results. Wainwright Investment Counsel, as you know, Madam Chair, appears monthly before the city's Board of Investment Commissioners. As Chief and Treasurer Lombardi has accurately pointed out, they give monthly reports and provide outstanding value in advising the Board of Investment Commissioners on matters such as asset allocation, target weight allocation, and conditions prevailing and preceding in the bond and equity markets, all of which the Board of Investment Commission relies upon to make its appropriate decisions. Also, this is bringing us from our actuarial firm of Siegel Company, Ms. Kathy Riley. Ms. Riley is the vice president and principal of Siegel Company and has provided actuarial services to the city for the past 6 years. And again, the actuary is the reports that we do annually, both the experience study and the annual valuation report. Those reports were the basis for the work that Hilltop began their work with in projecting the pension obligation bond transaction. Additionally, Madam Chair, we're joined by Ms. Karen Grandy. Karen Grandy, well noted and perhaps premier bond counsel in the state of Rhode Island. She has assisted us in almost every major bond transaction in the city of Providence, including this particular transaction. So I thank you for that opportunity, so that the members of your committee have an idea as to who has appeared here this evening to represent this transaction. So, Madam Chair, I take great interest in Treasurer Lombardi, Chief of Staff Lombardi's report. Nearly everything he has said in that report is consistent with information that we have shared as an administration. All of the safeguards, the guardrails that he has recommended, we support. We support continuous 100% payment of what's known as the actual determined contribution. For the record, Madam Chair, members of the committee, for the past 10 years, including the budget that's currently under your consideration for fiscal 22, would make 10 consecutive years of 100% payment of the city's actual determined contribution, formerly known as its ARC. And what that does, Madam Chair, is it has established fiscal stability. And despite that fiscal discipline, including the prudence of recently lowering the rate of return, as the treasurer pointed out, from 8% to 7%. At one time previously, it was 8.5%. I believe in the past 6 years, we have lowered it by 150 basis points, which in itself has added $300 million to the unfunded liability. So in fact, in being prudent, it has added additional liability. But we were prudent because our actuary said that we could no longer maintain a rate of return expectation of 8%. And people say that we enacted that just recently. And we in fact consider further if this transaction is proposed. Mr. Lombardi also mentioned the fact that we should continue to have some sort of a cap or restriction on the normal cost. I'm pleased to say that the normal cost on the city's annual pension payment represents 9% of the total payment. Therefore, 91% of the city's annual payment represents past service costs, the cost associated with those who are already in retirement, and in fact, for those who there is no other alternative. We have no ability to change that payment. Today's normal cost for the city is $12 million. It will be expected to grow to $24 million in 20-some years. It may double in 20-some years, but that would be considered normal in an average setting for any pension plan in America. So with that, Madam Chair, I focus on the notion that this transaction has its genesis in the notion that we will pay $93 million this year in the city's pension plan. Again, 91% of that is for past service costs. The pension schedule grows exponentially over the next 19 years. The final payment in 2041 and 2040 will be $227 million, clearly unsustainable, clearly growing at the rate of 5% a year. These payments will clearly crowd out all other budget opportunities that the city will have and make it nearly impossible to keep up with the growth of those payments without perpetual taxation increases equal to the rate of levy cap of 4%. That is clearly something that is unacceptable in city financial management. We asked the transaction to be priced because the market conditions are historic. And while we hear about risk, Madam Chair and members of the committee, there is risk associated in any transaction, but the risk can be limited and the risk can be identified. This is a two-part transaction. It is a bond borrowing. You heard Mr. Lombardi say that we are basically, while this may be a new borrow or a new debt, it is actually replacing an equal amount of debt that already exists, known as the unfunded liability. You may hear from time to time people who Google this transaction and look at information that's provided by the Government Finance Office Association, known as GFOA. They did a report in 2015. And in that report, they indicated that pension obligation bonds had high risk. And while they do, many things have changed since 2015. This transaction, in many ways, does not represent what they reported in general by the GFOA. As an example, the GFA reports that the transaction associated with pension obligation borrowing may involve itself with investment in what's known as derivatives or credit swaps. This is a transaction that will be fixed rate bond borrowing over a fixed period of 25 years as it has been constructed.
Sorry, Mr. Mancini.
Hold on, Councilwoman, I'm sorry. Mr. Mancini, could I ask you, are you referring to your PowerPoint, and would you like that presented for the committee?
Madam Chair, I was under the impression that the committee had received the PowerPoint and that you had asked me only to have a direct discussion. I'm happy to go from the PowerPoint if that makes sense. So I would then, that would make me catch up to you on page 3. So on page 3.
I think what we need to do is show the PowerPoint, sir, for the benefit of the committee, and just the ease of reference. I would ask that we move through it as quickly as possible so we can get to the other experts. So I would ask you to kind of call through. Councilwoman Anthony, do you have a question?
I can't hear him clearly. Is anyone else having trouble?
It was loud. My apologies.
I think
It's broken up. You can't hear every word he says.
He was coming broken up on my phone. I thought it was my phone. I shut it off, turned it back on, but I think it's
okay, okay, folks.
He's coming in and out.
Chief Mancini, is there any way that you could speak more clearly? We're going to monitor.
I will try to dial in.
That sounds good right now. Are you dialed in, or is that the same?
I am not dialed in, but I will have to do that, Madam Chair. My apologies.
Okay.
So on page 3, we ask ourselves the question.
Page 3 of Exhibit 2, and you are breaking up, Mr. Mancini.
Yes. So, Madam Chair, I don't have the dial-in number in front of me. May the clerk provide that to me so I can do that? I would need the passcode as well. My apologies.
Just wait momentarily. We'll send that out.
So, Mr. Mancini, what you need to do is on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen where it says Join Audio, there's a little tab that you can click up, and it says Switch to Phone Audio. It will give you all the information that you need.
You? And apologies to the committee for the delay.
£5. Enter your participant ID followed. You have entered the meeting as a panelist. Attendees can now hear you speak. This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Madam Chair, is that any better?
Let's give it a go, Chief.
Okay. I believe, is that quality better? The sound quality better?
Sounds better. Yes.
Okay. So the question we ask ourselves, Madam Chair, members of the committee, is how did we get here? So in the 1990s and the 2000s, the city, in fact, failed to make 100% of its actually required contributions. I think in that period of time, in 18 out of 22 years, the city did not make its 100% contribution. And I think that represented what was approximately $121 million of dollars that were not put into the system that today would have a present value, future value growth of close to $400 million. Today, the pension system is just 22% funded, and the unfunded liability or the debt totals $1.2 billion as of June 30, 2020. If I may direct your attention to page 4. During this administration, we have taken following steps to fix what we hope would be the problem. The previous administrations reinstated full pension payments under the Sicily administration. Under the Taveras administration, they had brokered retiree reform and a new payment schedule. And as of this year, the city will have made 10 consecutive payments, 10 consecutive years of 100% actually determined contributions to the pension system. This year's payment, $93.5 million to the pension plan and to the fiscal 22 budget. Today, the city's credit rating is BBB+, and continued reforms have taken place through collective bargaining agreements, most recently the negotiated FOP contract that this body voted and adopted at the recommendation of the FOP and the administration, with taking the city FOP contributions from the current 8% to what will be 13.5% at the end of the 4-year contract, having a long-term pension savings of between 25 and 30 million. Why a pension obligation bond? The fact of the matter is, Madam Chair, we are on an unsustainable path, and doing nothing is really not an option. In fact, it's probably the greatest risk of all. The contributions have steadily increased by an average of nearly 5% per year, outpacing the growth of the city's tax base. Even with 100% pension payments over the last 10 years, we are still only at 22% funded. There are risks involved with pension obligation bonds, but they must be balanced with the risk of doing nothing. We often say that the stars are aligning, and they are aligning because the current historically low borrowing environment is favorable to bond borrowing, particularly on a transaction of this type. Again, the city has a strong credit rating at BBB+, greatly improved over the past decade. A pension obligation bond is unlikely to negatively impact the city's credit rating. In fact, in 70% of the cases of pension obligation borrowing across America, there is no change to the credit rating. And then there's a broad alignment of support at the city level. We believe that in addition to the mayor and leadership of the city council, the city's bargaining units and the members of the Providence Senate and House delegation have offered their support and certainly would be in support if this transaction were able to move forward. The other options are limited. First of all, there's a 10-year freeze on the cost of living. Those increases end in 2023 based upon the 2012 consent decree. The Supreme Court decision established that the city cannot renegotiate with current retirees. Current retirees comprise 91% of the unfunded liability, and pensions are a major obstacle to future rating upgrades. If I may digress for a moment, Madam Chair, Solicitor Dana is here this evening because he'll answer any questions associated with both the 2012 consent decree, the recent Supreme Court decision on the opt-out clause, and of course, any questions that one may have on credit, bankruptcy, and those questions. So I'll go through the presentation, and so if there are questions associated with why we cannot do anything different, with due respect, I will defer to my esteemed colleague. On page 7, we talk about the details of the proposal. The city is proposing a $704 million, 25-year, fixed-rate pension obligation bond with a 10-year par call feature. That 10-year par call feature is an important element in this particular presentation. It's an element that permits the city in future administrations and future council administrations to have the opportunity to relook at that bond borrowing if more favorable conditions exist in that period and allow them to do that, to refinance without penalty, basically pay off the bond early without any penalty, much like a prepayment penalty exists on a mortgage. The par call feature allows for that. Today, the interest rates are viewed at between 3.5% and 4.25%. The assumed rate of return of 7% over the next 5 years, and then we hope to drop that rate to 6.75% for the remainder of the bond term. I said in my opening remarks that by dropping the rate of return from 8% to 7% recently, just that move, while it was meant to be totally prudent, added $200 million to the unfunded liability. But that's the consequence of lowering the rate of return, lowering the expectation of what we believe will be earned in the investment market. Historically, the pension has outperformed this projection, 7.6% return on our investments since the inception of services provided by Wainwright on July 1, 1996, and roughly for the same period as the bond that we're seeking over that past 25-year period. On page 8, we provide you with a projection of the payment schedule. The column to the left is a column of the current annual payments that are expected to be made between 2022 and 2046. You'll notice that after 2040, that's the 19-year amortization remaining on the current term. What remains is what we call normal cost, or the cost to fund a current employee's pension having no bearing on the unfunded liability. That's what we call normal cost, and that would be well within the range of normal cost in the United States. The column that follows, these are the payments associated with the bond borrowing and the remainder of the unfunded liability that we are not borrowing to pay off. When combined, those are the payments. To the right, you'll see the difference in the association, basically showing the savings per year as it accrues from 2022 right through 2040 and then to 2046. On page 9, we compare those payments in a graphic display. You can see that the orange line is the current projection and trajectory of the pension payments, while the blue line represents what's proposed under the pension obligation bond and the remaining unfunded liability. The space in between represents the savings or the relief of burden to the city budget. That's what that represents. On page 10, we ask ourselves the question, why is the POB the best solution, if you will, for the city of Providence? By borrowing now, with due respect, the city will be taking advantage of the best interest rates we have seen in many years. The principal interest payments plus the pension fund payments on the remaining unfunded liability will be less than the current required pension payment, which are growing at a rate more in line with the city's natural tax base. Shifting payments to a more sustainable growth structure will allow the city to make more investments in the current day infrastructure and programming for residents and businesses. We hear a lot of talk, and I praise Treasurer Lombardi as his predecessor on the retirement board and a member of the Board of Investment Commissioners previously, before my appointment as Chief Financial Officer. Madam Chair, members of the committee, I am in full support of the integrity that the Board of Investment Commissioners has demonstrated over the many years that I have served the city. We hear that talk, that the city's investment performance was not stellar. I'm here to tell you that, in addition to what the Treasurer has reported, Wainwright has shared information with both Treasury and Finance that supports that in every trailing year average, with the exception of the 5-year, which was a slight 2 basis points difference, the city's investment performance has outperformed the state of Rhode Island in the current day, 1-year trailing average, 3-year, 10-year, 15-year, and 22-year trailing average. In almost every one of those years, the city has achieved better than 7% return, which is now the current rate of return. I'm very pleased to report that to the committee. That appears on page 11 and is followed by a secondary graph on chart on page 12. I provided for you the investment performance statistics as they appear between the City of Providence's investment fund and the state of Rhode Island. And may I point out further, as Mr. Lombardi had alluded to, Madam Chair, members of the committee, not only have we at least equaled or outperformed the state of Rhode Island, the size of the city's portfolio is $373 million today, in comparison to the size of the state of Rhode Island portfolio of $10 billion. The state of Rhode Island's portfolio is 26 times the size of our portfolio. When you're that large, you can make investments that run different, longer duration, perhaps more quality duration, and may return better opportunities for return. The city has an immediate cash liquidity. The city pays $7.5 million monthly in pension payroll, representing $84 million per year, roughly 25% of the assets under investment. When you have that type of liquidity needs, there are rare opportunities to invest the city's pension assets in longer term, longer quality duration assets. That's one of the challenges that our investment advisor faces every day, every month, but yet still was able to perform admirably in these conditions, for the record. Page 13. Madam Chair, members of the committee and council, I think this is time where we spend a little more time discussing stress testing. The city asked Hilltop Securities to present stress testing under 2 scenarios. Under conditions that would permit perhaps the best rate of borrowing under current conditions, which would be on page 14 at 3.85% and page 13 at 4.39%. We'll start with page 13, and if you allow me to indulge. This is a stress test for a 25-year period, assuming a 4.39% all-in TIC, total interest cost, on a $704 million pension obligation bond. To the extreme left, the scenarios are pointed out as to what scenario was this transaction stress tested on. The columns that appear that follow. The first column is a net present value. Net present value simply means the value of the savings of all future savings when defined in today's present dollars. That's a net present value calculation. And projecting the differential between a pension obligation bond and 25 years reamortization versus a 25-year reamortization of the unfunded liability with no bond. In the second column, we do the same transaction under the current, but compare it to the 19-year current years remaining on today's current actuarially determined contribution and current amortization schedule. The third column shows you the rate of returns that we're using to test, and so does the fourth column. So we start with the base case. We start with our current assumed rate of return. Under the current assumed rate of return of 7%, under the pension obligation transaction, if we were to borrow at 4.39 and we achieved our 7% rate of return as we have approved, we would be looking at a $245 million net present value savings, nonetheless, on the transaction. Column 2, if we only compared the 25-year reamortization and a bond versus no bond, we would still be looking at a $154 million difference. Then we stress tested at 6.75 because we're contemplating that as a possibility, 6.5 and 5.5. For the record, Standard & Poor's requires stress testing minimally at 6%. Even at 5.5%, the transaction test is positively at $136 million of net present value savings when comparing it against the 25-year reamortization, and $46 million when compared against doing nothing. Under the break-even long-term investment returns, we break even on a 4.39% borrow if the city receives 4.476 as a return on its investment. That's a break-even availability for the city in transaction of 25 years, or 5%, 5.105% under the current 19-year amortization. Then the most important test of all, Madam Chair, the so-called Great Recession test. These are the results when applying the city's actual Great Recession activity results during the period 2008 to 2012. Even when doing that, and then followed by subsequent years of 7% return on investment, we learned that in the 25-year bond with a 25-year amortization, we learned that that still produces a $64 million positive return, while in the one that compares the 19-year, we go negative by only $27 million. And as it has been said to me, to go negative in that scenario by only $27 million on a $1.2 billion already liability, that would seem to be minuscule in comparison to the worth of this transaction. And then finally, there's a stress test known as the first-year investment returns that eliminate the expected differential. What would you have to sustain as a loss in the very first year of market investment upon taking the proceeds of this transaction and introducing them into the market? We would have to go 27% negative to do that, to wipe out any gains. And I submit that to you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee on page 13. Following that, and if you will indulge me further, on page 14 is under the conditions associated with borrowing at 3.85%. Should conditions exist that on the actual day of pricing and subsequently closing, that we were fortunate enough to receive a bond borrowing rate of 3.85%. And Madam Chair, I must digress for a moment. You should know that these are taxable bonds. And in almost every case in a taxable bond, they generally price at about 1% or 100 basis points, as it's known as, greater than a tax-exempt instrument. For the record, the city just borrowed, not but 1 month ago, on a $100 million school bond at 2.14% interest to show the committee the historically low efficiency of the borrowing market today. That was what it was a month ago. And so we asked Hilltop, price this under the optimum conditions, and they did so under 3.85%. And when that occurs, you'll see that that changes all of those numbers I discussed on page 13 to even greater and more favorable transactions. And so somewhere in that range is where we hope that the transaction will occur. For your benefit, we have prepared that information and it appears before you. And certainly I could go through each of those items, but the key numbers would be, what's the break-even number if we receive just break-even, no savings? The break-even number under the 25-year scenario is 4.175. That's the rate that you'd have to receive on a return of your investments in order to break even. What would be the provision of a Great Recession return? Even with the Great Recession, followed by 7% returns in the year thereafter, which is how it's measured under a Standard & Poor's model, we would see still a $106 million savings under the 25-year pension obligation bond, $15 million if there was a 25-year reamortization versus the 19. And may I say, Madam Chair, that in order to wipe out first-year investment gains that would be eliminated, we would have to go 35% negative on our portfolio, and I submit to this committee that that has not occurred in perhaps 40 years or greater, to my knowledge, or not at all. With that, Madam Chair, I'm going to try to keep this moving. I move to pages 15 and 16. I had these included for a very important reason. There's a lot of negativity that is out there, and I often hear the highly esteemed organization, which I am a member of, as is Treasurer Lombardi, the GFOA, both nationally and locally, the Government Finance Officers Association. Almost everybody on this call who has a finance appointment represents this organization. And they indicated back in 2015, so some of this is actually stale dated and doesn't exist in the current world. They indicated what the key things were that when you discuss a pension obligation bond. To the left, the GFOA's view was invested POB proceeds might earn less than the borrowing cost. Okay. Well, the probability of market earnings less than 4% is low, but they do exist. Stress tests will better quantify that risk. And we understand that there could be risk. But what we've seen with the Wainwright investment performance over a 22-year period is the consistency in almost every one of those trailing period averages. Every one of them, nearly 7% or 7.2%, which is where we're at today with our assumed rate of return. The next item they asked you is issuing taxable debt to fund the pension liability increases the jurisdiction's bonded indebtedness and burden and potentially uses up debt capacity. Let me make this point abundantly clear. We hear about the term soft debt versus hard debt. They use the term soft debt because they believe that soft debt means if there's ever a year that your budget can't support making your full pension payment, then you can choose not to do so. That is not true in the city of Providence. And the reason for that is as follows. Between the 2012 consent decree and the Supreme Court affirmation of the pension retiree opt-out case, we must pay 95% of the ARC, the actual term contribution, until we are 80% funded at minimum. So it is not a soft debt. It is not a debt that we have a choice that we could say we won't pay. It in fact is a hard debt, and a hard debt at least at 95%, demonstrating the fiscal discipline that the city has shown in the last 10 years by making 100% payment each of those years. And why I say that is because, as the treasurer pointed out, you would be borrowing, in this instance, a dollar amount that would be equal to the amount that we would be taking out of the hard debt at a more favorable rate, at whatever the bond borrowing rate is versus today's rate of return. Also, with General Assembly approval, Madam Chair, members of the committee, it will not count towards our 3% cap. In Rhode Island, all municipalities have a 3% bond borrowing cap, 3% of their total assessed property value. By going to the General Assembly and having General Assembly approval, which is why we're here tonight asking for your support in resolution of that legislation, we would not be inhibiting our ability to borrow under other projects like we borrowed 2 years ago, historically under the Capital Improvement CIP program, or just recently under bond borrowing. In fact, even under our bond borrowing, we seek General Assembly special legislation. So I've offered that as a counterpoint. The next item in the left-hand column, pension bonds are complex instruments that carry considerable risk and may include swaps or derivatives. Clearly, this criticism is outdated. There are not under any consideration market derivatives, swaps, credit swaps, or variable rates. This is only considered under a fixed rate bond borrowing transaction, only fixed rate. Page 2, item 16, page 16 rather, regarding GFOA. Pension bonds, quote, are typically issued without call options, making it more difficult to refund bonds if interest rates fall or a different debt service structure is desired in the future. Well, Madam Chair, members of the committee, this bond, given the rates that I quoted you, 4.39 and 3.85, both of those rates already include the cost for this provision of a 10-year par call provision, probably costing about 12 to 15 basis points. What does that allow us to do? In future administrations of mayoral and council, if bond borrowing conditions favored a refinancing or refunding then, or some other economic condition positively created the need to pay down the transaction, you would have that provision without penalty. Think of it like a home mortgage that if you got out of it early and had a prepayment penalty, you would have to pay that penalty. That penalty provision would not be made. You would get out at par value. That did not exist in the last transaction of this type, and the only transaction of this type in the state of Rhode Island, in the Woonsocket transaction. They did not have that provision. It did not exist in the industry. It did not exist. That's a very important point, and one that I asked the committee to keep in mind. Pension bonds are frequently structured in a manner that defers the principal payments. This pension obligation bond would not have any interest-only payments. It will reduce payments. Reduced payments would be minimized. And then lastly, rating agencies may not view the proposed issuance of pension bonds as a credit positive. Well, most recently, POB transactions are credit neutral and more likely to be credit positive than credit negative. And on the notion of credit rating agencies, Madam Chair, I've probably participated in 10 or more bond issuance rating presentations in the past 5 years or better, whether they were surveillance rating agencies, annual credit reviews, or bond transactions. While they give us high marks for stabilizing the city's finances over this past decade, what always comes up, what always injures our credit standing is our long-term liabilities associated with pensions. So I bring that to the committee's attention. Page 17, you heard me allude to a previous transaction in the state of Rhode Island. In the Woonsocket transaction in 2002, they borrowed $90 million. As of June 30 of this year, of 19 rather, they reported still remaining $66 million in outstanding pension obligation debt with an unrestricted net deficit of $290 million, due largely to pension and OPEB liabilities. Woonsocket did not have a par call option on their bond. It does not exist in that time frame. They borrowed at a rate that was close to 6% with an assumption that they would earn 7.5%. The 6% is clearly twice the size or 1.5 times the size of what we're contemplating. And we are already at 7% and contemplating lowering our rate of return to 6.75. And also, there were different investment decisions that were made in the Woonsocket transaction. I believe they had put most of their proceeds into a bond market, and the bond market did not do well. The city's current allocation of assets that are under investment, as most recently supplied by the services of Wainwright Investment Council, I believe it's a 60-40 mix or 65-35 mix between equities and the bonds, and it has turned out well. On page 18, what we consider those important things to know. This would not wipe out the entire debt, but rather it takes advantages of current conditions to save money down the road, like refinancing an unfavorable mortgage. The city would also choose to include this 10-year par call on at least a portion of the bond to give the city the option to refinance. This plan is conservative and well thought out, but we are only able to take advantage of this opportunity for a short period of time, given that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to take advantage of the most historic bond borrowing rates that we have seen for some time. And finally, what's the process and next steps? To proceed, the city needs a special act of legislature. Bills are currently before the House and Senate. We testified yesterday before the House Finance Committee. I believe we received a highly favorable impression on the House Finance Committee. The city does not require, nor is it requesting, the state to back or make payments on this bond. Solicitor Dana can provide questions on credit quality, risk, bankruptcy, and other protections. The city council must first approve the bond borrowing authority before we can even consider the transaction. Once we have secured, if we're so fortunate to secure General Assembly approval to move forward the transaction. The city could close on a bond if approved by the General Assembly as early as late August. Those processes and next steps, once passed, the city council and administration will work with a team of financial consultants to re-amortize the city's payment schedule, issue a bond. And now we are currently out to bid for proposals for updated investment advisory and investment council services. And may I say, Madam Chair, members of the committee, and as I've discussed with Treasurer Lombardi, including Mr. Bertinazi at Wainwright Investment Council, we have out to bid on investment advisory services as a best practices due diligence practice associated with best practices of purchasing. This is in no way a reflection to the services that have been provided by Wainwright Investment Council. It is, in fact, having represented the city for 22 years and having been to the Board of Contract most recently, I believe 3 years ago, it is just best practices in the area of purchasing and vendor. But I will say this here. It also gave us an opportunity while we were contemplating that transaction to begin with. We widened the scope of the RFP to include this particular contemplated transaction. We asked in the RFP, the city is contemplating a $704 million bond transaction, pension obligation bond. We asked a series of questions. How would you advise the city on best practices associated with market timing, transition of assets, investment of assets, et cetera, et cetera? And we're anxious to see how those proposals come back. And quite frankly, Madam Chair, members of the committee, given this transaction and the size of it, when added to the existing investment balance, bringing the city's investment assets to over $1 billion, much like the state, it may require more than one manager. It may require managers who specialize in certain industries and certain levels of investment expertise. And I say that because that decision will ultimately be made not only by the city, but with the recommendation of the city's Board of Investment Commissioners. With that, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation, and I'm available for questions, as is our advisors that were introduced to you previously.
Thank you. I'd like the record to reflect, I believe I saw Council President Ingliosi join us at one point. He's still here, yes. I'd like to recognize also Councilwoman LaFortune, who has also joined us. Anyone else there? Okay. All right, committee members, any questions for Mr. Mancini on his presentation at this point, or would you like to hear from Wainwright and then perhaps ask questions? Councilwoman Anthony?
Yes, I would like to. I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but I know that my fellow councilman Narducci brought up the fact that we had received or have Seth Magaziner has issued an opinion with regard to this pension obligation bond, and there are some questions within his opinion that I might like to pose to Mr. Mancini, and then he can tell me who can answer the question. Is that okay?
By all means. By all means.
Okay, thank you. I know that part of the one of the questions that Mr. Magaziner brought up was that he wanted to know, he wanted to say, he said the city should provide an analysis of how much of each year's projected savings from the proposal is projected to come strictly from the arbitrage between the POB interest rate and the projected pension fund investment return, as opposed to any re-amortization of the liability. And I know I've asked, I don't know who I've asked this question of before, but I think it's important for us to understand, because if the savings is purely from the projected interest rate arbitrage, if it's relatively modest, it suggests that the potential benefits of the POB aren't significant enough to justify the risks. So I really wanted to ask if you have an answer to that question.
I do. So, Councilwoman, we were asked that question early on, and we have done everything in our power and endeavor our power to provide as much information that addresses that comparison. And Hilltop Securities had provided multiple scenario schedules. And if it has not yet been clearly defined or clearly identified, we're certainly happy to work with the information that the General Treasurer has asked for. I believe I have provided his office with information exactly on the analysis associated with what's associated with the so-called arbitrage, the difference between investment gain, bond cost, and investment return, and the reamortization. I will tell you this, the reamortization period of the proposed obligation bond adds 6 years to the amortization. It was done primarily to be consistent with the 25-year repayment of the bond. Put those two terms in alignment. A combination of either Mr. Cray from Hilltop or perhaps Ms. Riley from Siegel could explain to you what that difference might look like. It's my understanding that, the most instances, the most favorable amortization term probably would be not less than 20 years, but 25 years would not be unusual. So if that hasn't answered it directly, I don't have a numerical value before me to share that with the committee, but I'm happy to provide that through your internal auditor or treasurer.
I appreciate that. I'd very much like to see that analysis that you've provided, because I think it's something that we all should see and look at before we make any kind of decision. So I appreciate your response to that. I also have another question on the stress test. So, and this also comes from Mr. Magaziner's letter. I know that, so he says the Providence administration has provided the results of investment stress tests performed by the city that suggest the proposal will allow the city to save money even if the annual investment returns of the bond proceeds are low as 4.725. However, it appears that this result is arrived at by applying a 4% discount rate to future cash flows, creating a result that we believe to be misleading. Could you respond to that?
I'd be happy to, but I would be best served if I could have Mr. Cray address that, as his team provided what I call the backup analyses that resulted in the summaries that you have before you. Well, Mr. Cray?
Yes, thank you, Chief Mancini. Councilwoman Anthony, Madam Chair, members of the committee. So the stress tests that we ran for the city that you saw in that presentation were done based on what our firm typically does for Standard & Poor's, for the rating agency, as Chief Mancini said. And that is one of the net present value calculations that we do, and we use 4%. There is not a standard for choosing the net present value rate, which is basically the rate at which you net present value the future dollars back to today's dollars. So it is possible to run those at different net present value rates. And if we received a request to run it using 3% or 5% as opposed to 4%, that is something that we could do, and we could share those results. So if it's desired to see it at a different rate, we would be more than happy to provide that information as well. It's just a mathematical computation.
And Mr. Cray, the numbers that you're using, have you received those numbers? The numbers that you're working with, are you working with Siegel?
Yes, absolutely.
Explain that to me a little more clearly, please.
Sure. So the unfunded liability, it's only been said 30 times tonight. The unfunded liability, as well as the amortization, comes from the most recent published Siegel report for the retirement system. In addition, any new amortization periods that we've been directed to look at, Siegel has prepared. So we take the information from the city's actuary, because Siegel is certainly the expert. Ms. Riley on the call is the lead. We take those numbers from Siegel. What Hilltop projects are the bond rates. And then we use those bond rates that we project, because that's what we do. We deal with the bond market. We make the projections for what the bond will cost, and then we marry all that together in those various tables that you see. So that's a good question. That's the process we use. The only thing that actually comes from Hilltop are the projected bond rates, the 3.85% and the 4.39%. Those are the two scenarios the city showed, as well as, what would the projected debt service be based on those bond rates. And then we marry that with information from Siegel. So the actuarial information comes from them. And then the investment information, obviously, Mr. Bertinazi from Wainwright is the appropriate party on the investment side. This marries those three disciplines.
Thank you. That's all.
Councilwoman Anthony?
That's all I have right this minute. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think it would be appropriate and benefit the entire committee in this process if we actually get a copy of Treasurer Magazina's letter, so that we entered into the record, can discuss it further, but also get answers to each one of the items or the questions that he poses. So I'm going to ask the clerks to seek out that letter and get it for us, and then get official responses. Yes, Councilwoman?
I can send it to the clerk.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask the General Treasurer to direct it to the committee. Thank you, Councilwoman. I see Council President Igliozzi has his hand raised.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a couple of follow-ups for Adam Cray. Could you possibly, why don't you perform those two mathematical equations? Do a, 3, 4, well, you already did the 4, do a 3, a 5, whatever, and then also, can you tell us when the state looks to do that, what do they use? Like, do they use 3? Do they use 4? Do they use 4? Like, let's see what the state uses as their compass. So this way we can apply what they apply. Right. So if you could do that, so I'm doing apples to apples, if you could. And I just would ask you just to have that done as soon as possible, so this way we can look at it. I think that would be beneficial for everybody, And then also, if there are other questions in that, the General Treasurer's statement, that maybe we could forward to Mr. Cray. Mr. Cray, I think it'd be beneficial maybe, and I ask, of course, anybody else from Mr. Mancini, whoever else, then maybe you go point by point, and whether, yes, no, maybe, and give an explanation on his letter. I think that'd be beneficial. This way, just instead of like picking and choosing, we just do it, and then show backup of why you chose A, B, or C, but definitely be beneficial to do that, to do those exercises ASAP. And then.
Thank
give
you,
us
Council
updates.
President.
Thank you.
So I will get the letter and we'll submit it for the record. Councilman Anthony, you have your hand raised again.
I'm so sorry. It's just that we were talking about asking for more data, and I guess I thought maybe this is the appropriate time. I think we should be running more stress tests in general, because, these are significant decisions. We have to know what the risks are in order to properly vet this. So I'm wondering if we might, so I have two, I was thinking. The S&P 500 began 1968 at 96.11 and ended in 78 at 96.11. It was an 11-year span with no gain. Can we perform a stress test with the first 11 years at 0% return on the stocks? And then the second one I might suggest is doing a stress test where the stock portfolio loses 29% over the first 7 years. And that is similar to what happened in 68 also. So if those two could be done, I'd really, really appreciate it. I think it just will give us, we just need to, flesh out our due diligence, I think. So I would so appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilman Anthony. I think if we could just agree that we've been asking for more stress testing on, I think the Council President raised a good point, as do you, and we will get more stress testing to help us make a more informed decision. But at this point, we have other people that need to present, and I think that it would be advantageous to everyone if we allow the presentation to continue and then ask questions globally. I think we can get to the end, Mark, a little faster and more efficiently. So with that, I think I would like to ask to go through the Wainwright presentation or parts of it that Wainwright would like to go through, if that's okay. So we have Exhibit 3, and I'd like Eric Bettenazzi, if he could lead us through this as quickly as possible.
Be happy to.
You don't need to hit every slide, but just give us the salient points, sir.
Yes, I'll go quickly, Chairwoman Ryan. So if we can turn to page 3 of the presentation.
Can we talk about page 2 though first? There's a nice summary document or a summary message that's presented, and what is highlighted is past performance is never a guarantee of future investment results. Actual results may vary. I think that is an overarching message for your presentation here, and an important one. But continue, please.
I would agree, and that's always the case with portfolio construction and portfolio management across time. That is always to be stressed. Past performance is never a guarantee of future investment results, and they will in fact vary. So that's a good point, for sure. We point that on a regular basis. On page 3, this is just extracted from our monthly report that we provide the Board of Investment Commissioners. And you can see that it lists the returns and dollar amounts by manager, by exposure in the portfolio. And it shows what our returns were year to date. And it shows that year to date, the portfolio is up 8.9%. I guess it's, no, I don't know. Can everybody see that still? It's not on my screen anymore.
Madam Clerk, did we lose that? I think she's trying to make it more visible for everyone.
Okay, I'll wait then.
Just wait a second and she'll get that for us. She's clicking feverishly here.
Okay.
Pick the right one. You got it. Well, can you make that any bigger? the plus arrow? Every once in a while, I have a good move. Okay. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Please continue, sir.
Thank you, Chairwoman Ryan. So as you see on page 13, we don't have to spend much time here. It just shows it's a very diversified portfolio between equities, both domestic and international, fixed income, bonds, if you will, both domestic and international. We have some alternatives as well. And so far, again, this was updated through May 14th at our last meeting. It shows the portfolio is up 8.9% year to date. And at that time, there was 376 million approximately in the portfolio. If we can roll forward to page 4, this question was asked. I was asked to provide this. These are the trailing time period net of all fee returns for the assets in the portfolio. You can see, for example, on this page 4, in April, we made 3.3%. At that time, this is for the full month, through April, we were up 7.8% year to date. The trailing return over the past 12 months was 30.4%. And the annualized returns for the previous periods are what you see there. So over the trailing 3 years, 8.8% per year, trailing 5 years, 9.1%, trailing 10 years, 7.9% per year, and since inception, 7.6% per year. If we go forward to the next page, this shows the dollar value by year end, going back to 2008, just to show the progression of what's been in the portfolio. Remember, there's money going out of the portfolio all the time, money going in, and there's returns. So that's what leads to the portfolio behaving the way it is, shown on this page. If we go forward, you'll see that this is another part of the report that we provide. It shows the contributions and withdrawals by month to the portfolio across time, and this goes back to fiscal year 2006. And in the yellow, you will see what the difference is between what went into the portfolio and what was withdrawn from the portfolio, and what those contributions were. And you can see back in those days, most of the time there was more money coming out of the portfolio than was going in. However, if you were to roll forward to pages 7, 8, and 9, you will see that in recent years, if you go to page 8, please, and page 9, that the city has made really Herculean efforts to put in more money into make these ARC payments, of course, as was discussed earlier. And if you go to page 10, you'll see that in recent years, basically the same amount of money has been going into the portfolio that has been coming out. Additionally, you'll see that in recent times, we basically taking $7 to $7.5 million per month out of the portfolio in order to make benefit payments. So that is a large liquidity requirement. That is about 2% of the portfolio must be liquidated each month in order to meet benefit payments. That if you annualize that out to a year, it's up around 24 or 25% of the portfolio must be spent each year. Now, of course, we get contributions going back in, and you can see them on the page when they come. They come in different times during the year in different sizes, etc. But nonetheless, you have to have a lot of liquidity, a lot of exposure that you can get to quickly in order to generate this large liquidity need. And that large liquidity need feeds into the type of asset allocation that is recommended to the board, the types of assets you hold, the duration or length of maturity on your bonds, for example, the amount and types of equities that you hold, other types of investments that are available for institutions to consider. That all feeds into what you can and can hold your liquidity needs matter quite a bit. And that's what this part of the presentation shows. Again, inflows and outflows across time, but large liquidity needs relative to the size of the portfolio. If you go forward to the next page, please go to 12. This shows what has already been presented. I was asked to produce this. This shows the year-by-year returns of the city and the year-by-year returns as reported by their website for the state's website, and you can see what the portfolios have each done across time. You can see markets sometimes go up a lot, sometimes they go down a lot, sometimes they're flat. They're all over the place. This is the most recent 20 years. That was all the data that I could find on the state's website. And I was also asked to present the returns over the trailing periods. If you look down at the bottom of that page, look down towards the bottom, you'll see that we have the comparison of returns of the city versus the state year to date through April, 7.8 versus 6.6. Trailing 1 year, the city's up 30.4%, the state up 24.6. 5 years, 10 years, 15, and 20 years, as well as the assets as of April 30th that were in the city's portfolio versus the state's. Again, these numbers were discussed earlier in the presentation. And the last page is just a allocation.
Excuse me, Mr. Bertanzani. My eye drew to calendar year 2020, the city returns versus the state returns, 6.4 on the city side versus 11.9. Can you explain what you think might have caused that differential? What would you attribute that to?
The city's asset allocation, long-term strategic asset allocation, is different than the state's portfolio for sure, and is mostly because of the value exposure. The city's portfolio has a significant exposure, a significant part of its portfolio in value stocks, things that like financials and industrials and energy and other areas like that that are generally termed value stocks in the marketplace, as opposed to, say, growth stocks. And there's plenty of those in the portfolio too, but those are sort of technology. You might think of Apple and Microsoft and Amazon and biotech and other things like that. So we have a good chunk of the portfolio in the value stocks in the asset allocation. Last year.
So would you say, would you say that's a more conservative approach?
In the long run, probably yes. In any 1 year, it can work in either direction. They tend to have higher dividend yields on value stocks. They tend to have lower price to earnings ratios, lower price to book ratios, price to cash flow ratios, things like that. They tend to be more established, but they also tend to have slower earnings growth rates, both in the present time and expected in the future. They also have different sensitivities to changes in interest rates. So one of the things that has mattered a lot in recent years was that interest rates have continuously fallen. And when interest rates are falling, most of the time, that's usually better for growth stocks than it is for value stocks. That's what that means. And so, however, very recently, in the last 6 or 9 months, for example, value stocks have far outperformed growth stocks. And that's one of the reasons, for example, the portfolio has done a little bit better than the state over the trailing 1 year, as you can see in the data as well. So really, it's about the strategic long-term asset allocation and how the various market conditions behave and affect the portfolio across time.
Okay, thank you.
That's all that I would have for my part of the presentation. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
I think, Councilwoman Anthony, you have your hand up. Is that from before, or is it a new question you have?
It just is, if you would just remind me, so what I saw was what, the size of the portfolio right now is 373 million, is that correct?
Yes, as of May 14th, it was 376 million.
Okay, okay. And then will you remind me how you charge your fees?
We charge a fixed fee, a constant and fixed fee of 265,000 per year.
Okay, thank you. And that would, may I just ask if you were to invest this $700 million, would that fixed fee stay the same?
We've committed to keep it the same for an additional 3 years, and it has been that same fee for 4.5 years.
Okay, and then you would presumably be renegotiating that with the city.
Yes, I wouldn't want to be presumptuous and assume that it was me at our firm at that time, but yes, we would commit for at least that amount of time.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, I don't know who could answer this, but what is the likelihood in the past of the investment returns exceeding the bond interest rate over the full term of the bond? What's the likelihood of that happening? The investment rate returns exceeding the bond interest rate over the full term of this bond.
So, Madam Chair, I would have to defer to Hilltop. I don't know of any transaction that we have participated in that would constitute a pension obligation transaction where there is a debt issuance associated with repricing the unfunded liability and then having investment proceeds invested in the market and expecting to get a return close to or better than the rate of return. Mr. Cray, do you know of any transactions that, or do you have statistics that support that from industries such as Standard & Poor averages?
I do not, but we would be happy to look to see if there is some sort of report, Madam Chair, that's Councilwoman, that's a look back on prior transactions. I'd be absolutely happy to look.
Thank you. Can I ask another question? How many POBs have been floated in the past in Rhode Island by the city? And what percentage of those that have been floated have actually worked as they've been promoted or advertised? Do we have that information?
To my knowledge, Madam Chair, the only transaction of its type is the now known transaction as the Woonsocket transaction, to my knowledge, and while that has had some notoriety, I think I presented to the committee significant distinctions and differentiations between that transaction that existed back at that time and the transaction that's being required or being requested for your consideration.
Thank you. You did already present that. Council President, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to also add on to that dovetail question. You said, what will be the likelihood of it making the bond rate of return? I would also apply the same question to what's the likelihood of us making our 7% rate of return just with the present $376 million? Because it'd be the same equation, right? Because basically you're investing with this bundle of money in the same system. So what's the likelihood we're going to maintain 7% rate of return for the next 25 years? There's no, it's the same. So like if we're not going to get that, if our expectation is only 1%, then the 376 is going to disappear too, right? So that goes.
Correct.
Away. So Mr. Messina, can you help me with that one too?
I can. So, Madam Chair, I believe what the President is saying, and Mr. Bertinazi, if you could support me in this particular conversation, because we had these discussions always, Madam Chair. This is not in just preparation for this evening. I'm an active participant as an advisor to the administration with the Board of Investment Commissioners and had previously served on that board. In the general picture of it, one would view a successful transaction in any period of measurement where your rate of return, your actual return, is greater than your bond indebted rate. But the same fact remains that if you did not achieve your assumed rate of return in any market under any measurement period, that would be true, and that impact would occur on your existing portfolio, even without a bond borrowing. If there was a sustained loss, for example, if the city only earned 6% in any given year against what was expected to be 7%, that 1% impact would be felt and would be absorbed by the existing assets, even without a bond transaction where new proceeds are in. But I think the experts should weigh on that, and I think that would be either Mr. Bertinazi and certainly Ms. Riley. Ms. Riley probably has her own view of that, but if you would permit me, Madam Chair, I think each of them can bring a very good perspective to that discussion. Mr. Bertinazi, if you would.
Absolutely.
Sure. The lower the debt rate on the bonds, of course, the greater the opportunity to outperform over the long run. So I'll start the answer by saying that we cannot be certain. There are no guarantees, of course, as always. And the future is very hard to predict, of course. However, historically, there's over a 25-year period, the odds are quite reasonable that a well-diversified portfolio with equity in sort of the amounts or near the amounts and the types of investments that would be held in fixed income, that type of an asset allocation, the odds are reasonable that you would beat that rate of return over the 25 years. However, what is quite likely, in fact, we're certain, is that there will be some years where their returns are negative, some time periods where you don't beat it. You come in less than the 4% or whatever the number turns out to be, and sometimes they will be negative. And if you just look at the reports that have been provided, you will see that there are several negative years in the last 20 years or the previous 25 years. Some were large. So I think what is quite certain is that there will be bear markets in the next 25 years. There will be bad times. There probably will be good times, and everywhere in between. That's what the last century or so of historical data shows us. So I think it's quite likely that will happen again in the future. At least at some period, during some periods of time, there will be losses, there will be negative results, and you will trail the return of the interest rate on the debt. However, over the full 25-year period, the odds are reasonable, probably well in excess of 50%, better than even, that you would beat that rate, that you would have greater than a 4% return. You see over the since inception, it's 7.6%. So there's quite a spread there. Now, interest rates are low now. I'm sorry to drone on, but it's a full answer for your question. Interest rates are low now, and that is sort of the raw material of the expected return going forward. And with interest rates very low now, it may be the case that you don't earn as much in the next time period going forward with rates this low. That does matter. So expected returns across the industry are now lower in the future. That is, our industry expects lower returns in the future than in the past, but there's a large spread between 7.6 and 4%, and probably not that low. So the odds are good that it could be beaten, but the odds are also very high that along the way, there would be times when you're underperforming the debt rate and in fact have some negative returns in there as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Can I yes, Chief Mancini?
Madam Chair, if you permit me, Mr. Bertinazi, I was actually trying to get to the Council President's point that nonetheless, rate of return in any market condition, would it not apply even to today's portfolio without bond proceeds?
Yes, if you underperform the 7% rate, you will still accrue unfunded liability, the same amount of unfunded liability, regardless of what your return is, because implicitly you already owe the money.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair.
So we have Hilltop with us. Would they like to make a presentation or speak to this matter for us? Before we do that, I'm sorry, I just recognized Council President Pro Tempore is with us, Pedro Espinal. Thank you for joining us, sir. Hilltop, would you like to weigh in here?
Madam Chair, I am here just to answer questions, so I do not have any prepared remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. And that leaves us with Michael DeBiase. You were called to make a presentation tonight. Would you like to share your thoughts with us, please?
Sure. Councilwoman Anthony, I don't know if you had a question first. I saw you raised.
Sorry.
Please continue, Mr. DeBiase. Thank you.
I know I'm not in the position to recognize people, Chairwoman. Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the committee, for inviting me. My name is Michael DeBiase. I'm the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization, which is a long phrase. We have as our members Rhode Island's leading for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, nearly all the private colleges and universities. We've been around since 1932, and actually our first incarnation was as the Providence Government Research Bureau. So we were actually set up to do studies of the Providence budget back in 1932. One of our strategic areas of focus is the fiscal health of Rhode Island cities and towns. We're publishing a series of reports on this topic. Our first report came out in April. It's available on our website, ripec.org. It hasn't hit the bestseller list yet, but I recommend it to members of the committee. I wanted to say a few things at the outset. I'm not an expert on investments, nor am I an expert on municipal bond markets or an actuary. I have some knowledge around budgets and pensions because of my experience being around. I want to commend the mayor and the city council for trying to address the city's financial challenges, which are, I believe, the most serious financial issue we have in the state right now. In particular, I want to recognize the mayor for being very open and direct about the enormity of the and scale of these problems, and also to the mayor and his team for being very available and discussing a lot of these proposals. So I appreciate it. I wanted to, and I'm sorry for the long windup, but I think it's important to
it's important. Thank you. We appreciate it.
It's important to put this proposal in context. So the city's unfunded pension liability is the biggest of the financial challenges facing the city, but not the only one. The city has a $1 billion OPEB liability, and as far as I know, is completely unfunded. There is no ARC for OPEB. That I think is more history than logic. Unfunded OPEB liability doesn't look a lot different to me than the pension liability. So the city also has a challenging revenue picture with relatively high commercial and tangible taxes, relatively high non-owner occupied residential rates, and generally not a lot of headroom on property taxes to raise more money. In my opinion, some of these very serious issues have not been in the front burner over the last several years because we've had a strong economy, and also there's been large annual increases in state school aid, which has given the city some relief on that side of the equation. So the mayor's pension obligation bond proposal seeks to deal with the most imminent problem, which is a rapidly increasing ARC payments, which are now at 17% of the budget and will crowd out spending over time. So I agree that doing nothing is not an option. If you just look at those projections, you're going to have, it's already high, and you're going to run into a serious problem in terms of constraining the spending. And I think the pension obligation bonds should be assessed during these given the situation, which is a very challenging one. The city may very well have a set of not so great options. And because of that, I'm not going to substitute my judgment for yours in whether this pension obligation bond or some manner of it makes sense. But I do want to share a few concerns for your consideration. One is that pension obligation bonds are generally disfavored as a financial strategy. There's been a lot of talk about the GFOA. I think the administration has been correct that some of the misgivings of the GOA perhaps don't, or they actually don't apply here. But that was a board vote by that leading organization in 2015 that basically told government finance officials to stay away from pension obligation bonds. And this is still a pension obligation bond. It's not some new modern flavor of that. So I think it has to be taken into account that the GFOA position, which has not been modified, is still valid. The basic criticism of pension obligation bonds is they're a bet on the investment markets and how they'll do, and it's a bet on the timing, and basically that you'll earn more in your investment returns and you pay in interest. So, what's changed is the interest rate environment. So pension obligation bonds are more attractive now, and we're seeing more of them because of the historically low taxable interest rates, around 4% or even less. With investment returns, the assumed investment returns is 7%. So that spread, that 300 basis points, let's say, is very important if you're thinking about risk. Obviously, the bigger the spread, the smaller the risk in terms of loss. So I think that's something to consider. So, the pension obligation vehicle is not different, but it is in a more attractive environment because of this interest rate spread. That being said, there's still a significant risk of loss. One is it may not be the best time to invest $700 million into the market. Asset values are relatively high. From what I read, interest rates are low, which means securities that earn interest, bonds, are going to be low yielding. And the other consideration is the size of the bond increases the risk. So, this is a simple concept. If you're making a bet, the bigger the bet, the bigger the risk of loss. And the city doesn't have a lot of cushion. So it's a complicated situation. This may be the best time to borrow for a pension obligation bonds, or certainly at historically low taxable bond rates. But cities like Providence that turn to a pension obligation bond often don't have the luxury of deciding the best time to invest. There was some testimony here that there would be some planned investment strategy, perhaps, although I don't think the assumptions in the presentation actually assume sitting out the market for a period of time. There's not a cushion to absorb the loss. So this isn't a situation where you have a lot of room to have losses. So I wanted to get to the key point is that if you do the pension obligation bond, the pension fund will be 65% funded. And I think everyone knows that that's actually not, it's factually true, but isn't really the case, because the liability is just in another set of books someplace. The only way that the pension obligation fund improves the funding situation is if the investment bet is a winner. And it is more likely than not that it will be because of that spread, at least from what I've seen. So you have some leeway. It's not like you're borrowing at 7% and you have an investment return at 7%. That would be, at even or worse. So you are borrowing at a much lower rate. But the projections that you're seeing in terms of the savings to the city, if I understand them correctly, assume that those borrowed funds will earn 7%. So they're not assuming that they're going to make more than 4. They're actually assuming that it's not that you're just going to win the bet a little bit. You're actually going to earn the 7. Now, of course, you're not going to suffer a loss unless your overall return is less than the 4, if that's what you borrow at. So this is where I think the amortization issue becomes important. Keep in mind, the imminent problem is the increasing ARC payments. That's the thing that's kind of prompted a lot of this. the city has decided to use a 25-year bond instead of a 20, and they've also, in their plan, proposed to amortize the liability from 19 to 25 years, which is actually a separate issue to the pension obligation bond. So it'd be helpful to know how much of those savings are attributable to the amortization, how much is from the assumed return, the 7% return of the pension obligation bonds. So what's being done in this plan is the reamortization and the assumed investment returns are used to reduce the city's ARC payments, which are currently for FY22 at around $93 million. Under the plan, the city would be paying less than $93 million for several years. So, I was the director of administration for the state, and I understand why that is a good thing, because you're creating room to spend on other things in your budget. But I think it's one thing if you're trying to limit the increases of your ARC payments, and it's another thing if the strategy is to actually reduce the city's commitment. And I think that if you have a pension fund that's 22% funded and you're contributing $93 million, and it seems like you can afford to contribute $93 million, I think it would be worth considering whether to at least maintain that level of contribution over time. I mean, you could make a more aggressive argument that perhaps it should remain the same proportion of the budget, but I think at least not going backward on that. And then the last point I make is that the plan doesn't include, and you've heard this before, any structural reforms of pension obligations. So there's nothing being done here on the liability side of the equation. I recognize there are serious legal difficulties in modifying the retiree benefits, but there are some opportunities to make benefit changes on that for active employees on both the pension and the OPEB. I know the OPEB is kind of off the side, but I've heard in testimony recently that that's a very, the health benefits for active and retirees, I heard that it's like $100 million, which is like 19% of the budget, which is kind of a staggering number if you think about it. So, and that's not even with an ARC, that's just the current payment. So I think dealing with that, and why that's important, it's important for a couple of reasons. First, that I think this pension obligation bond at this size will discourage to some degree benefit reform, because there will be less urgency for it. So there is a reason to do it now. But the other is that if you do get some structural reforms on the liability side, then you can offset this risk. So if you do have a loss, let's say the bet doesn't go well, and the city loses, say, $40 million. Well, if you've created benefit reforms on the other end, of 60, then at least the whole thing would work out a little bit better for the city. So I think this is a difficult decision. I'm very much appreciative that you hear from me. I'm humbled because you have, definitely much more expert professionals on this than I am. And so, I do commend you for trying to attack this problem, but I think it's good to be clear about what you're actually trying to accomplish and what the results of these various moves are. Happy to take questions with the rest.
Thank you, Mr. DiBiase. That was some good comments and insight. We appreciate your opinion. Any questions, Mr. Igliozzi, Council President Igliozzi?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, one of the, Mr. DiBiase, thank you, by the way. Actually, we actually had a previous conversation about the idea of what you mentioned earlier, which was that if we take out the pension obligation bond, and although the ARC payment goes down, that part of what the council could do, or part we could do with the administration, is we say that you have to keep the ARC payment at a higher point for so many years. So this way we create even a greater, like you just mentioned, we have right now, we're paying 93 mil. So we keep that number for the next 10 years, and that'd be, or next 5 years, whatever it is. And then we can create an additional buffer. That money, more money goes into the system, and then also can help with some rate of returns when they don't make the, the best rate of return. So what I would ask is, could the actuarial, whoever's around, Mr. Mancini, could you have Hilltop or Wainwright put together a plan that shows if we maintain the, is it 93 million, Mr. Mancini?
It's 93 million.
Right? So what if we did this? What if we, could you have them do the mathematical equation where you do the 700 million, like you said, you have that money invested, but then now you, instead of taking advantage of that ARC payment, because people are concerned that future councils and future mayors may get a little reckless with the money. Not like that ever happens, but then if there's like says that you have to pay X plus 10% more or whatever it is, and then it's on, oh, you maintain the $93 million for the next whatever years. And then what would the equation look like then? And I think that'd be very beneficial, because I think that's a really valid issue. And I think it also potentially addresses one of the issues that we could address, because Mr. DBA said two things. It's very difficult for us to deal with collective bargaining agreements. The unions have won over and over again in a court of law. And there's only one body that can actually supersede those contracts, is the state legislature. And they haven't been willing to do that either during the Tavares years, or I don't see them doing it now, where they could actually change the collective bargaining agreements in the city level. So that's the only way that's going to happen. The court of laws have ruled against us consistently. But there's one thing that we could do on this matter, is that we could put this financial governor on it, where you have to pay at least the 93 million for the next so many years. And that's something we can do as part of this. And we could still keep on fighting and filing lawsuits against the pensioners and the collective bargaining, but unfortunately that hasn't gone very well. But this is something that we could. So I asked Mr. Mancini and his crew if he could provide that mathematical equation. I think that'd be very beneficial. And also, I do want to understand a little bit more about. I know Mr. DBA is mentioned against the 2015, but Mr. DBA isn't the pension obligation bond, the types of pension obligation bonds in 2015, are they the same they are like today, what we're talking about? So back in 2015, did they offer a fixed rate and a par call and all that back then? Is that what you're saying? That basically the bond, because what it sounds like they're saying is that the bond instrument, the pension obligation bond legal instrument hasn't changed and the parameters haven't changed. What I'm hearing, it has. So can someone reconcile that with me? Has it changed or has it not changed since 2015? And then if it has, what has changed? Thank you, Madam Chair.
So
Thank you, Council President.
So if I could just address that, I mean, Council President, I'm not an expert on that. My point is, I admitted that there's a number of features that you don't have here, although I think that the criticism of the pension obligation bonds, the primary criticism revolves around the risk of investment loss. So I don't know if that's actually changed. It's less so because of your spread. So I would defer to someone else as to whether there's, the types of pension obligation bonds are more friendly to government or not.
Thank you, Mr. DeBiase. Chief Mancini, do you have a response to that?
I do, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. DeBiase. We've had a good conversation, even previously, you and I, and I appreciate the fact that while you count yourself not as a fiscal advisor, you're certainly well respected, and I count myself as one of those among them. Madam Chair, we've testified previously this evening that there are some differences, and they are most notably the fact that in 2015, the vast majority of pension obligation bonds involved themselves in investments that were less than desirable and would not be even offered today. Things that were not fixed instruments. They were credit swaps. They were derivatives. They were partially due to the collapse of the market that subsequently followed in many years during those times. Additionally, there was not in existence when the transaction last known here in Rhode Island existed, basically known as a par call. That's a very important feature. A very important feature, not for the sake of investment opportunity or bond structuring, but even for future governments, for future administrations that those elected officials may find more attractive a refunding or refinancing. And may I just say that while Mr. DeBiase has said so, that the risk of investment loss, while it would be carried with any new investment proceeds, Madam Chair, I respectfully submit that that same risk of investment loss exists even today with no new bond proceeds. It exists not only for the city of Providence, but for all other pension plans, including the state of Rhode Island. And I submit that with respect. Thank you.
Thank you. The 10-year call is obviously a great feature. The fixed rate structure is also a great feature. However, I do think, and it was mentioned earlier, and I can't remember who mentioned it, we do need more stress testing because just to get to the 10-year, we need to make sure we're in good shape and nothing goes wrong in that 10-year period. So the call doesn't give us any security unless we can get to it safely. Mr. Lombardi, you had a question or a comment that you'd like to make at this time?
Just a follow-up, Madam Chair. So one of the things that I mentioned, Mr. President, Mr. DBAs, was that we must control and limit normal costs, and these probably need to be in the bond documents. And what that would do is the council or a future mayor could not increase the unfunded liability. Now, it may occur naturally, like if you lower the rate of return or the life expectancy, is expanded, but a future council or mayor could not increase the unfunded liability. I'm just if we can control and limit normal costs, we can get there on that issue. And that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. Sure.
Madam Chair? Madam Auditor, please.
Just to follow up what the treasurer said, if we are to control normal costs, we need to do it this fiscal year. In the last experience study, we had a payroll growth of 2.1%. The next one may show a payroll growth of 2.75% based on our contractual wage increases. For fiscal year 22, it's 3.33%. That is our average wage increase for union employees. When you do that to the 3% of the experience study, we're already exceeding it. So now we have to control hires, non-contractual wage increases, and we need to do it in this budget. That's all I have. Thank you.
The auditor just had to bring this conversation back to the matter, an immediate matter at hand, and that's budget deliberations, which we're in the middle of. Thank you, Madam Auditor. That's a very good point. And I think the guardrails that were expressed by Mr. Lombardi are important. President Igliozzi mentioned a few generated by the discussion from Mr. Dibier. So I do think that those are important things that we need to be mindful of and look at. Anybody else have any questions for anyone this evening? Any comments, any thoughts? Council President, you have your hand still up. Is that just a residual hand or?
No, I put it up, but I'll defer to Councilwoman Anthony first and then I'll speak. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Councilwoman Anthony.
Yes, the one I was interested in hearing from is Siegel Consultants, and this is the reason why. I would like to have a consultant review the calculations involved with the stress test done by Hilltop. And no offense to Hilltop, we wouldn't be doing our due diligence if we didn't have someone verify the data and how they perform those stress tests. And I guess I thought, I understand they used Siegel's charts and all their projections, which we know what they are because Siegel comes and talks to us, but I wouldn't mind Siegel doing an actual review of the work that has been done by Hilltop, because I think that's where we're relying on those stress tests. We need to know the data, be sure that it's done correctly and done by, reviewed by an outside.
Thank you, Councilman Anthony. We have Kathleen Riley here. Did you want to respond to that question? From Siegel?
We haven't been asked to look at the stress testing side of it, but we certainly can work with the CFO and Maria and everybody else to verify the numbers to the best of our ability.
Chief Mancini, can we do that for Councilwoman
By all
Anthony?
means.
Thank you,
By all
Councilwoman
means.
Anthony. Do you have more questions?
No, I
By all
guess I'm
means.
just gonna say that, I'm just gonna say this because I'm feeling it right now, and I am a little concerned that we are asking to go forward with this without going to the voters. I think it's possible to do that in a short amount of time. I understand the urgency, but I would also, like to think about, what that would look like, if we could put together a tight schedule so that we could actually go to the voters with this issue. And then the other thing I think maybe we should be exploring as council people is if we're uncomfortable with the $700 million figure. I've heard many people say it could be reduced. If we're worried about the liability and the risk associated and all those things, we could also possibly think about reducing that figure. So I just wanted to share those thought processes right now.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank everybody for participating. It's been very enlightening conversation, and I think it's been very beneficial to the council and the body. I think there's a lot of good ideas about if we do go down this road, how we can make it better and be a better product. We mentioned about putting the financial governors on it or financial guardrails, which the auditor I know has a litany and the treasurer does, and I think, and I especially like the idea creating a fixed OC payment for so many years that's actually higher. So this way you have that buffer. I think also that we can always talk about what are the different figures: 700 million, 600 million, 500 million. What's the benefit of all of them? And I think that's a valid. The voter initiative is voter initiative. It is what it is. Do we have the timetable? Can it happen? Can it happen in a short enough time? And does it work? Because I think what drives this, and I have to say this, I think the only thing that drives this conversation, I don't think any of us would be here today if it was a year ago or a year and a half ago. We wouldn't be talking because the interest rates went so ridiculously low. And a year from now, we probably will say, we're not doing it. Because unfortunately, here I go. This is my third time around this pension obligation bond conversation. And each time, went through all these kinds of machinations, but never was the interest rate so ridiculously low. It's just astounding. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you do it, but it does give you a sense of like, this is something that is a once in a lifetime chance. And therefore, if there can be a voter initiative, what's the time span that we can do it? And what's the short frame? Because if it's going to take a year and a half to do voter initiative, well, then it doesn't make any sense why even put us all through this? If it's something that can be turned around 2, 3 months, 4 months, then that's something we should think about. But I believe what's before, right now is, gathering more information. So I believe it sounds like there's a lot of homework to be done, and hopefully we can get some more of these answers. And then we can go from there and decide if we even, the idea of supporting the idea, but maybe we put a bunch of restrictions in the resolution. I know there's a resolution before the committee, like saying like the council generally likes the idea, but these are the restrictions we would like to see in it. By the way, ultimately, and I can assure all my council members this, if the legislature did say the council, the city could issue this bond amount, it has to come before the council and the finance committee anyway, in which then we would then have the final say on what the bond would look like anyway. So I want to say that gives me great assurances that we have that checks and balances. But it doesn't hurt that if we modify the present resolution, if we so choose to, with those financial governors and ideas baked into it. So the legislature knows that we're just not saying give us 700 million and we're just going to go spend it, at the casino, but we are taking it serious. And if we do this, we're going to do our due diligence on whether or not how much we spend. Do we spend that much, or do we issue that much, and all the governors. So I would also look forward to the additional information, as well as ideas of maybe we amend the resolution with all our financial concerns and governors in it, and we plug it in there. And then I think it will show that the council was being very deliberative and thoughtful. And I think that's important. On the alternative, I have to say to my present colleagues and my future colleagues who I will not be serving with you, is that we've been fighting this matter for decades. And I'm not going to get into the history of it because some of the history is there's bits and pieces to it that people leave out. Like, and I'm going to say this, the original investment committee was run by a non-investment company. Actually, it was run by the unions. The unions ran it. They did the investment portfolio. In fact, at that time, they invested in strip malls. And they would actually give portions of the investment portfolio to city employees to invest in their private functions. And I want to say that those are really bad old days. And I have to say that over the years that when the city took the initiative to hire a professional outfit like Wainwright over the years, they have shown during difficult times that they've been able to perform the best they could, and they've done a very good job. And people may say I'm biased because I'm also a board investment commissioner. Well, I just stepped down, the chairperson's on it now, but I've been on it for many years. So I've seen the cycles of investments and the ups and downs. And I was there in October 2008 when the market dropped, and everybody was, not just us locally, but the entire country, the entire nation was frightened about what was going to happen with everything, their own personal. And one thing that I kept in the back of my head was, and I also ask everybody to think the same. Yes, we have our ups and downs in this country. But at the end of the day, either you believe in America and its investment portfolio and its structure and its economic and the world and its ability to perform and grow today, and I presume all of you are investing personally, well then, in some instances, I gotta hope that America is gonna be here 25 years from now. That it'll be a strong, vibrant, economically thriving country. And that is still that's the great leap, by the way. It's just not whether or not if Wainwright performs or this performs, does America perform? So I just ask you to remember that, because if this doesn't perform, the state's pension system doesn't perform, your personal pension system doesn't perform, no one's performs, because we're all getting the same types of rate of returns, generally based on our investment portfolio in this past year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I'm sure if anybody has any kind of money and they're investing, they probably have seen those same ups and downs. I'm sure all of you lost a third or almost 40% of your portfolio in 2008, like the rest of us. But now you've seen it grow. Well, but you kept on buying, kept on investing because you believed in America. I choose to believe in America. That's where I am. So with that, I look forward for the additional information, Madam Chair. I look forward for the additional stress test studies, as well as I look forward to seeing that maybe we can craft a better resolution that puts on financial governance and restrictions, that talks about what we think is a better product, potentially a better product, that we can maybe help with this situation. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee. And
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council President, for your remarks. So I think where we're at, first of all, I want to add my thanks to all of the folks who came and made wonderful presentations tonight. I do think this was a great discussion and answered a number of questions that I know I've fielded from council people. I do think there's more work to be done. And I think that what we identified, I tried to keep a running list, and what I have is, as the auditor had pointed out, we need to add to the plan a policy to control the normal cost. That's a significant issue, and as the auditor mentioned, that's not in the existing budget that's before us. So that is a concern for us. So let's look at that. We want to look at the voter initiative timeline, as brought up by Councilwoman Anthony. We want to look at modeling perhaps a lesser amount to see what that might look like. We want to do more stress testing. We want to look at guardrails as Mr. Lombardi presented, as well as the Council President, and also some thoughts from Mr. DeBiase. The guardrails or governors are important to this, to make it more palatable and reduce some of the risk that's associated with it. Councilwoman Anthony also asked if we could get Siegel to review the hilltop analysis so that's something that we want to get some further work done on, and also begin to consider certain amendments to the resolution. So that's my laundry list. There may be others. Councilwoman Anthony.
I am so sorry, very briefly, I would also like to know how the fees work. Who's being paid what for, if we were to go forward with the POB?
The cost of the bond issuance?
More of the fees also associated with the various consultants that we have working on this. How they're all going to charge and how they're paid.
Okay.
Is one of them, yeah.
Okay, so with that, we have more work to do. Again, I thank you, each and every one of you, for your contribution to this meeting tonight. I think it was great. And with that, I'd like to ask for a motion to continue this meeting.
So moved.
Get a motion.
Motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by Councilwoman Anthony. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Okay, that is all we have on our agenda, finance agenda tonight. I would like to make a personal note of thanks to the council president for returning to the finance committee. It was truly a pleasure to have you with us this evening. It brought back great memories
Thank you.
of my years of service with you. With that, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion made by Councilwoman Castillo, seconded by Councilwoman Anthony. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.